The great hall of the Galactic Council fell silent as Ambassador Kethfer stepped forward. His blue-scaled skin caught the artificial light, and the deep scars running across his face told stories of battles no diplomat should have witnessed. The 300 representatives from across the galaxy waited for him to speak. They had called this emergency session after receiving his urgent request to address the Council about humanity. Kethfer's voice was steady, but carried an undertone, a fear that made several aliens shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Honored members of the Council," he began, "6 months ago, you classified the human species as a minor threat to galactic peace. You assigned me to observe their military capabilities and report back on their potential for expansion beyond their home system. Today, I stand before you to tell you that this classification was the most dangerous mistake in our Council's history." The Vorthon representative, a tall being with 4 arms, clicked his mandibles in what passed for laughter among his kind. "Ambassador Kethfer, you speak of a species that still uses chemical explosives and metal projectiles. How could such primitives pose any real threat to the advanced civilizations of our galaxy?" Kethfer's eyes darkened. "That is exactly what I thought when I first arrived in their solar system 3 years ago. The humans were engaged in a border conflict with the hegemony fleet over mining rights in the asteroid belt. Our intelligence suggested it would be a brief encounter. The hegemony had superior numbers, energy weapons, and shield technology. The humans had old-fashioned kinetic weapons and what appeared to be a death wish." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "I was assigned to the human battleship Guardian, commanded by Colonel Jake Morrison. When I first met Morrison, I thought the Council had made an error in even classifying humans as a minor threat. He was small by galactic standards, barely reaching my shoulder. His uniform was practical rather than ceremonial, and he carried an ancient projectile weapon on his hip like some primitive warrior. The memory played out in Kethfer's mind as clearly as if it were happening again. He had walked onto the bridge of the Guardian expecting to find chaos and panic as the human fleet prepared to face a superior enemy. Instead, he found calm efficiency. The crew moved with purpose, their voices quiet and professional as they prepared for battle. Morrison welcomed me aboard with what humans call a smile," Kethfer continued. "He showed me to the observation deck and told me I would have a perfect view of the engagement. When I asked him about his battle plan, he simply said that they were going to show the hegemony what humans do to bullies. I thought this was typical human bravado covering up fear." The Council members leaned forward, intrigued to spite themselves. Wars between minor species were common enough, but something in Kethfer's tone suggested this story would be different. The hegemony fleet consisted of 12 heavy cruisers and 40 escort vessels. They had been raiding human cargo ships for months, taking supplies and selling human crew members into slavery. The human fleet that opposed them numbered only 8 ships, including the Guardian. By every calculation known to military science, the humans should have retreated or attempted to negotiate. Kethfer's voice dropped lower. Instead, Colonel Morrison opened communications with the hegemony commander and delivered a message that I initially dismissed as primitive posturing, he said, and I remember his exact words. "You have 60 seconds to release our people and leave our space. If you refuse, we will remove you. This is your only warning." Several council members made sounds of amusement. The idea of an inferior force threatening a superior one seemed absurd to beings who had spent centuries calculating optimal military strategies based on technological advantages and numerical superiority. The hegemony commander responded by targeting the Guardian with all 12 heavy cruisers. I prepared to record the details of humanity's defeat for my report. Instead, I witnessed something that changed my understanding of warfare forever. Kethfer's claws scraped against the speaking platform as his hands clenched involuntarily. The humans did not retreat. They did not attempt to negotiate. Instead, they accelerated directly toward the hegemony fleet at maximum speed. Morrison's tactical display showed what appeared to be a suicide charge, but his crew responded to his orders without hesitation. The silence in the hall was complete now. Even the most skeptical representatives could hear the genuine trauma in Kethfer's voice. What happened next violated every principle of space combat that I had studied. The human ship split into 2 groups and attacked from opposite directions simultaneously. They used their smaller size and superior acceleration to get inside the hegemony's defensive formations. When the enemy ships tried to target them, the humans would slip behind larger vessels, forcing the hegemony to choose between destroying their own ships or losing their targets. Kethfer's eyes stared into the distance as he relived the battle, but the most terrifying part was their willingness to sacrifice themselves for tactical advantage. Captain Linda Gray of the destroyer Phoenix deliberately rammed her ship into a hegemony cruiser to disable its main weapons. As her ship broke apart around her, she transmitted coordinates to the rest of the fleet, allowing them to exploit the gap she had created. The Galactic Council had witnessed many battles over the centuries, but the idea of deliberately sacrificing expensive warships and trained crews for temporary advantages seemed wasteful and irrational. I watched from the Guardian's bridge as Morrison coordinated the battle with calm precision. He never raised his voice, never showed panic, even as enemy fire struck his ship. When his weapons officer reported that their main guns were damaged, Morrison ordered the crew to ram the nearest hegemony vessel. I thought he had lost his mind. Kethfer paused to let the implications sink in. The ramming attack was not a desperate last resort. It was a calculated maneuver designed to create an opening for the other human ships. Morrison had studied the hegemony's formation and identified their command vessel. By sacrificing the Guardian, he could eliminate the enemy's coordination and leave their fleet vulnerable to the remaining human ships. The council members exchanged glances. This level of tactical sacrifice was unprecedented in their experience. Most civilized species viewed the preservation of trained personnel and expensive equipment as paramount military objectives. As the Guardian approached its target, Morrison turned to me and said something that I will never forget. He said, "Ambassador, you're about to learn why humans don't back down from a fight. We're not the strongest species in the galaxy, and we're not the smartest. But when someone threatens our people, we'll tear the universe apart to protect them." Kethfer's voice became barely audible. The collision destroyed both ships instantly. I survived only because Morrison had ordered me to the escape pod 60 seconds before impact. As I drifted in space waiting for rescue, I watched the remaining human ships finish destroying the hegemony fleet. What had begun as a hopeless battle ended with complete human victory. The hall remained silent as the implications of the story settled over the assembled representatives. A species that would sacrifice their most advanced warships and experienced commanders for tactical advantage represented a completely different kind of threat than anything they had encountered before. That was my first lesson in human warfare. Kethfer concluded. I learned that humans do not fight the way civilized species fight. They do not calculate acceptable losses or negotiate strategic withdrawals. When humans fight, they fight to win, regardless of the cost to themselves. That, honored council members, is why our classification of them as a minor threat may doom us all. Ambassador Kethfer stepped closer to the center of the Galactic Council chamber. The representatives had grown quiet after hearing about the first battle, but he could see doubt in their eyes. One military disaster did not prove humans were a galactic threat. He needed to tell them about the rescue mission that had changed everything. 3 weeks after the asteroid belt engagement, I received new orders from this council, Kethfer began. You wanted more detailed observations of human military doctrine. I was assigned to accompany a human fleet on what their commanders called a routine patrol mission. I thought I would be documenting standard peacekeeping operations. The Zephyrian. Ambassador's scales darkened as he recalled the memory. The patrol fleet consisted of 3 destroyers and 12 fighter craft. We were investigating reports of hegemony raiders near the outer colonies when we received a distress signal. The colony ship New Hope had been captured while transporting families to establish a new settlement. Several council members made sounds of sympathy. Colony ships were considered neutral targets by most civilized species, attacking civilians. Violated the basic codes of warfare that had governed galactic conflicts for centuries. The New Hope carried 12,000 people, Kethfer continued. Men, women, children, elderly couples seeking new homes among the stars. The hegemony had taken them to use as bargaining chips in their territorial disputes with humanity. were holding the ship inside a massive fortress station called the Iron Hammer. The description of the enemy stronghold sent murmurs through the assembly. Fortress stations were nearly impregnable defensive positions designed to withstand attacks from entire fleets. A single fortress could hold off hundreds of ships for months. I was aboard the destroyer Defiant, commanded by Lisa Hayes. When she received the distress signal, I expected her to call for reinforcements. The Iron Hammer was protected by shield generators, energy cannons, and a garrison of 5,000 hegemony troops. Standard military doctrine would require at least 50 ships to assault such a position. Kethfer paused, letting the mathematics sink in. 3 destroyers against a fortress station was not a battle. It was suicide. Instead, Commander Hayes gathered her captains for what humans call a planning session. I listened as they discussed the assault with the same calm professionalism I had witnessed during the asteroid belt battle. Captain Ben Turner of the Ranger suggested using his ship as a battering ram. Captain Matt Stone of the Vigilant volunteered to create a diversion by attacking the fortress head-on. The casual way the human officers discussed sacrificing their ships and crews disturbed many of the alien representatives. Such decisions should require careful consideration, mathematical analysis, and approval from higher command authorities. Felt obligated to point out the obvious tactical problems with their plan, Kethfer said. 3 ships could not penetrate the fortress shields. Even if they somehow reached the station, they lacked the firepower to disable its defenses. Mission was impossible by any reasonable standard. The ambassador's voice carried a hint of the frustration he had felt during that conversation. Commander Hayes listened to my analysis with patience, then responded with words that I have never forgotten. She said, "Ambassador, you're thinking like a Galactic Council strategist. I'm not trying to destroy the fortress. We're going to get our people out of there." Kethfer began pacing as he continued his account. The human plan was unlike anything in standard military texts, so they would not attempt to overwhelm the fortress with superior firepower. Instead, they would use speed, surprise, and what Hayes called controlled chaos to achieve their objective. Details of the plan gradually emerged as Kethfer described the briefing. The humans had studied the fortress design and identified its weaknesses. The station's massive size made it difficult to track small, fast-moving targets. Its defensive systems were designed to repel large fleets, not individual ships attacking from unexpected angles. Captain Turner would pilot the Ranger directly into the fortress's main docking bay, Kethfer explained. The impact would disable the bay doors and create a breach in the station's hull. Meanwhile, Captain Stone would attack the shield generators from the opposite side, drawing the defenders' attention away from the rescue operation. The plan required precise timing and extraordinary courage. Turner would have to navigate through the fortress's defensive fire while flying at maximum speed toward a target barely larger than his ship. Stone would need to survive long enough against overwhelming odds to keep the defenders occupied. Commander Hayes would take the Defiant through the breach created by Turner's sacrifice, Kethfer continued. Her crew would then fight their way through the station's corridors to reach the imprisoned colonists. The entire operation would need to be completed in less than 30 minutes before hegemony reinforcements could arrive. Several council members made sounds of disbelief. Fighting through a fortress station with a single ship's crew was beyond reckless. It violated every principle of force protection and tactical common sense. I tried once more to convince Hayes that the mission was impossible, Kethfer said. I pointed out that her crew would be outnumbered 50-1 inside the station. Their primitive kinetic weapons would be no match for hegemony energy rifles. Even if they somehow reached the colonists, they would never be able to evacuate 12,000 people under combat conditions. The ambassador's expression grew distant as he recalled Hayes's response. She looked at me with what humans call a smile, though I now know it was actually an expression of grim determination. She said, "Ambassador, those people are counting on us. We're not going to let them down." The human assault began exactly as planned. Turner's ship screamed through space toward the fortress, absorbing massive amounts of defensive fire. Kethfer watched from the Defiance bridge as the Ranger's hull glowed red from energy impacts. But Turner never deviated from his course. The collision was spectacular, Kethfer reported. Turner's ship punched through the docking bay doors and exploded deep inside the station. The blast disabled the fortress's primary power grid and created a gap in its defenses. Captain Stone immediately began his diversionary attack, drawing enemy fire away from the breach. Hayes guided the Defiant through the opening with skill that bordered on the supernatural. The ship's hull scraped against twisted metal as she navigated the debris field created by Turner's sacrifice. Once inside, she deployed her crew with military precision that impressed even Kethfer. What I witnessed inside the Iron Hammer changed my understanding of human nature, the ambassador continued. Hayes's crew fought with weapons that should have been obsolete, but they moved through the station's corridors like unstoppable forces of nature. They did not retreat when faced with superior numbers. They did not surrender when cornered by enemy troops. The human soldiers had trained for this type of mission their entire careers. They moved in small teams, using their knowledge of the station's layout to avoid major enemy concentrations. When they encountered resistance, they fought with a combination of tactical skill and desperate courage that overwhelmed their opponents. Lieutenant Carol White led a team of 12 soldiers against a garrison of 200 hegemony troops, Kethfer said. She used explosive charges to collapse corridor sections, trapping enemy forces while creating new routes to the prisoner areas. When her team ran out of ammunition, they continued fighting with improvised weapons and bare hands. The rescue operation succeeded beyond all logical expectations. Hayes's crew reached the colonists and began the evacuation, while Stone's diversionary attack kept the fortress defenders occupied. But the most remarkable part of the mission was yet to come. As the evacuation proceeded, I realized that the humans had planned for something I had not considered, Kethfer concluded. They were not just rescuing the colonists. They were making sure the hegemony would never use civilian hostages against humanity again. Before leaving the station, Hayes's crew planted charges throughout the fortress. The Iron Hammer was completely destroyed, along with its entire garrison. The message to the hegemony was clear. Taking human civilians would cost them more than they could afford to lose. The Galactic Council chamber had grown colder as Ambassador Kethfer continued his testimony. The alien representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, beginning to understand that humanity represented something far more dangerous than they had imagined. But Kethfer's most terrifying account was yet to come. 6 months after the rescue mission, the hegemony decided to end their conflict with humanity once and for all. Kethfer began. They assembled the largest invasion fleet in their history. 300 warships, supported by troop transports carrying 500,000 soldiers. Their objective was simple: the complete conquest of the human home system. The numbers alone were staggering. No single species had ever faced such an overwhelming assault and survived. The hegemony had calculated that humanity would surrender rather than face total annihilation. I was stationed aboard the Human Command Center Olympus station, observing their defensive preparations. Kethfer continued. Admiral Frank Cross commanded the human fleet, which numbered fewer than 60 ships. By every military calculation, the humans should have evacuated their system and sought refuge among allied species. The Zephyrian ambassador's scales darkened as he recalled the memory. I had never heard of such a thing, but the reaction of his staff told me it was significant. Every human officer in the command center became deadly serious. They stopped making small talk and began working with an efficiency that was almost mechanical. Kethfer paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the assembly. I asked Admiral Cross what the last stand protocol involved. His answer chilled me to my core. He said, "Ambassador, when humans are faced with extinction, we don't just fight back. We make sure that destroying us costs the enemy everything they have." The protocol was unlike anything in galactic military doctrine. Most civilized species had contingency plans for evacuation or surrender when faced with impossible odds. The humans had created a plan to make their destruction so costly that no enemy would ever attempt it again. The first phase involved converting their entire industrial capacity to military production, Kethfer explained. Every factory, every workshop, Every manufacturing facility on every human world began producing weapons and ammunition. Civilian engineers worked alongside military designers to create new types of explosive devices and defensive systems. The transformation was remarkable in its speed and scope. Within days, the human economy had shifted from peacetime production to total war preparation. Shopping centers became ammunition depots. Schools became training facilities for civilian militia units. But the most disturbing aspect was how ordinary humans responded to the protocol, Kethfer continued. Families with children volunteered for the most dangerous assignments. Elderly couples offered to pilot suicide ships against enemy vessels.
Nice.
Teachers and doctors trained with military weapons while continuing their normal duties. The ambassador's voice grew quieter as he described scenes that still haunted his dreams. I watched a human grandmother named Betty Ross teach her grandchildren how to build explosive devices while helping them with their homework. She spoke calmly about both subjects, as if preparing for war was as natural as preparing dinner. Admiral Cross had explained the human philosophy behind the protocol. They believed that some things were worth dying for, and freedom was at the top of that list. If the hegemony wanted to conquer humanity, they would have to kill every single human in the process. The second phase involved preparing every human settlement for siege warfare, Kethfer reported. Cities were turned into fortress complexes. Buildings were connected by underground tunnels filled with supplies and weapons. Every structure was rigged with explosives that could be detonated remotely. The preparations went far beyond simple military planning. Human engineers had spent decades studying urban warfare and developing techniques to make their cities unconquerable. Every apartment building could become a sniper's nest. Every subway tunnel could become a supply route for resistance fighters. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Blake supervised the fortification of New Geneva, one of humanity's largest cities, Kethfer said. She showed me through the defensive preparations with obvious pride. Schools had been converted into command bunkers. Hospitals had been moved underground and connected to weapons manufacturing facilities. Blake's plans were both brilliant and terrifying. She had calculated that the hegemony would need to destroy the entire city to eliminate human resistance. But the destruction would cost them enormous resources and provide no strategic benefit. Blake explained that the hegemony could conquer New Geneva, but they would gain nothing but rubble and corpses, Kethfer continued. The humans had removed everything of value and prepared to fight for every room of every building. The enemy would spend months capturing a worthless ruin while human forces elsewhere continued to resist. The psychological aspect of the protocol was perhaps its most effective component. Human propaganda broadcasts described in vivid detail what would happen to any hegemony forces that attempted to occupy human territory. The humans promised a war without mercy, without quarter, and without end. Admiral Cross showed me recordings that were being transmitted to the hegemony fleet, Kethfer said. Human soldiers spoke directly to their enemies, explaining that surrender was not an option. They described the weapons they had prepared and the tactics they would use. The message was clear. Conquering humanity would require killing every human in existence. The hegemony invasion began as planned, but the human response was immediate and devastating. Instead of fighting a conventional space battle, the humans implemented asymmetric warfare on a scale never before seen in galactic history. Human fighter pilots loaded their ships with explosives and flew directly into hegemony capital ships, Kethfer reported. They used their smaller vessels as guided missiles, targeting enemy command centers and weapon systems. Each attack eliminated dozens of enemy fighters while destroying only one human ship. The tactics were brutal in their effectiveness. Hegemony commanders found themselves facing an enemy that refused to follow established rules of engagement. Human ships would ram enemy vessels without warning. Human soldiers would detonate explosives rather than surrender when captured. The most shocking moment came when the hegemony forces reached Earth's orbital defense platforms, Kethfer continued. Commander Blake transmitted a final message to Admiral Cross before the enemy assault began. She said, "Tell my daughter I kept my promise. Tell the galaxy that humans don't start fights, but we finish them." Blake's sacrifice epitomized the human approach to the Last Stand protocol. She had rigged the entire New Geneva orbital platform to explode when enemy forces boarded it. The blast destroyed 3 hegemony heavy cruisers and killed thousands of enemy troops. But it also eliminated Blake and her entire crew. What terrified me most was Blake's expression during her final transmission, Kethfer said. She was smiling. She was proud to die for her people, and happy that her death would save other human lives. I realized that every human in their military felt the same way. The hegemony invasion stalled, as their commanders realized the true cost of conquest. Every human position required massive resources to capture. Every victory was Pyrrhic leaving, the enemy weaker than before. The humans were turning their own destruction into a weapon against their conquerors. After 3 months of fighting, the hegemony fleet commander requested negotiations, Kethfer concluded. Half his ships had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair. His army had suffered casualties approaching 80%. He had conquered several human colonies, but holding them required constant reinforcements and resources. The Last Stand Protocol had achieved its objective without requiring the complete extinction of humanity. The hegemony realized that conquering humans would cost more than any possible benefit. They withdrew from human space and never returned. Admiral Cross explained the protocol's ultimate purpose during our final conversation, Kethfer said. The humans had not simply prepared to die fighting. They had prepared to make their death so expensive that no rational enemy would pay the price. They'd weaponized their own extinction and used it to guarantee their survival. The Galactic Council chamber remained silent as the implications of the testimony sank in. Humanity had created a form of warfare that transcended traditional military thinking. They had made themselves unconquerable by making conquest meaningless. Ambassador Kethfer's voice grew darker as he prepared to share the most disturbing chapter of his observations. The Galactic Council members had listened with growing unease to his accounts of human defensive warfare, but they were not prepared for what came next. After the hegemony withdrew from human space, I expected the humans to celebrate their victory and begin rebuilding, Kethfer began. Instead, Admiral Cross called me to his office 3 days after the last enemy ship had departed. What he told me that day revealed a side of humanity that I pray I never witness again. The ambassador's scales had turned almost black with the memory. Cross showed me a list of names. Every hegemony commander who had participated in the invasion, every officer who had ordered attacks on human civilians, every politician who had voted to approve the war. He told me that the war was not over. It was just beginning. The human concept of justice extended far beyond simple military victory. They had documented every war crime, every civilian death, every act of cruelty committed during the invasion. Now they intended to hold their enemies accountable. Cross explained that humanity operated under something they called the Nuremberg Principle. Kethfer continued. Following orders was not an excuse for committing atrocities. Every individual who had participated in crimes against humanity would face judgment, regardless of their rank or position. The principle was named after an ancient human legal proceeding, but its application in modern warfare was unprecedented. Most galactic conflicts ended with peace treaties and prisoner exchanges. The humans were planning something entirely different. I was assigned to accompany Captain Rick Stone on what the humans called deep strike missions, Kethfer said. Stone commanded a specialized unit trained in what they termed targeted elimination operations. Their mission was to hunt down specific hegemony leaders and bring them to justice. Captain Stone was unlike the other human officers Kethfer had observed. He was quiet, methodical, and possessed an almost supernatural patience. His crew consisted of volunteers who had lost family members during the hegemony attacks. They were not soldiers seeking military glory. They were grieving relatives seeking closure. Our first target was hegemony Colonel Krextu, who had ordered the bombardment of the human colony on New Darwin, Kethfer explained. The attack had killed 8,000 civilians, including an entire school full of children. Stone's team spent 4 months tracking Krextu across 6 different star systems. The human approach to pursuit was unlike anything in conventional military doctrine. They did not attempt to capture their targets through overwhelming force. Instead, they studied their enemies with the patience of natural predators, learning their habits, their fears, and their weaknesses. Stone's team infiltrated hegemony space using captured enemy vessels and forged identification documents. Kethver continued. They posed as merchants, refugees, and even enemy soldiers to get close to their targets. I watched them spend weeks, observing Krexthu's daily routine, mapping his security arrangements, and identifying his psychological vulnerabilities. The humans had developed psychological warfare into an art form. Before eliminating their targets, they would conduct what they called education sessions. The war criminals would be forced to confront the consequences of their actions. When Stone's team finally captured Krexthu, they did not simply execute him, Kethver said. They showed him recordings of every human child who had died in the New Darwin bombardment. They read him the names of the victims. They made him watch footage of the funerals and listen to the grief of the surviving families. The process was designed to ensure that war criminals understood the human cost of their decisions. Kethver watched in horror as Krexthu broke down completely, begging for mercy and claiming he had only been following orders. Stone's response was cold and final, the ambassador recalled. He told Krexthu that the children on New Darwin had begged for mercy too. Then he executed the colonel with an ancient ballistic weapon, ensuring that his death was neither quick nor painless. The psychological impact of the deep strike missions extended far beyond their immediate targets. Word spread throughout hegemony space that human hunters were pursuing anyone who had committed crimes against civilians. Former war criminals went into hiding, changed their identities, and fled to remote worlds. Our second mission involved tracking Admiral Vexther, the architect of the hegemony's civilian massacre strategy, Kethver continued. Vexther had personally ordered the executions of captured human colonists, including women and children. Stone's team pursued him for 8 months across 12 different star systems. The hunt for Vexther demonstrated the full extent of human patience and determination. Stone's team would follow leads for weeks, only to discover that their target had moved on. They never gave up, never lost focus, and never stopped gathering intelligence. During the pursuit, I learned about the human concept of generational justice, Kethver said. Stone explained that if his team failed to capture Vexther, the mission would be passed to the next generation of human soldiers. The hunt would continue for decades if necessary, passed from parents to children until justice was achieved. The idea that humans would dedicate multiple generations to pursuing individual war criminals was foreign to most galactic species. The practical costs seemed to outweigh any possible benefits. But humans measured success differently than other civilizations. When we finally cornered Vexther on a remote mining world, it assembled a small army of mercenaries for protection, Kethver reported. Stone's team numbered only 12 soldiers, but they approached the fortress with the same calm confidence I had observed in previous missions. The assault was brutal in its efficiency. Human soldiers moved through the enemy defenses like unstoppable forces of nature. They had studied their opponents for months, knew every weakness in their security arrangements, and exploited every tactical advantage. Stone personally confronted Vexther in his command bunker, Kethver continued. The admiral tried to negotiate, offering information about other hegemony war criminals in exchange for his life. Stone listened patiently to the proposal, then rejected it completely. The human captain's reasoning was simple and terrifying. Vexther had forfeited his right to exist when he ordered the murder of innocent civilians. No amount of cooperation could restore the lives he had destroyed or comfort the families he had devastated. Before executing Vexther, Stone forced him to watch recordings of every human child who had died under his commands, Kethver said. The admiral wept and begged for mercy, but Stone's expression never changed. He told Vexther that mercy was for the innocent, and he had proven himself guilty of the worst crimes imaginable. The execution was carried out with the same ancient weapon stone used for all his targets. He believed that war criminals should die by the same primitive methods their victims had faced. Not through clean energy weapons or painless injections. As we departed the mining world, Stone explained the purpose behind the deep strike missions, Kethver concluded. The humans were not seeking revenge in the traditional sense. They were establishing a precedent that would deter future war crimes against their species. The message was clear and unambiguous. Anyone who committed atrocities against human civilians would face inevitable justice, regardless of how long it took or how far they fled. The human capacity for patient pursuit was unlimited. I asked Stone how many names remained on their target list, Kethfer said. He showed me a document containing over 3,000 entries. Each name represented a hegemony officer or official who had participated in crimes against humanity. Stone's team was just one of dozens of hunter units working their way through the list. The systematic nature of the human justice system was perhaps its most frightening aspect. They had documented every crime, identified every perpetrator, and assigned teams to pursue each target. The process would continue for years, possibly decades, until every war criminal had been eliminated. Stone's final words to me summarized the human philosophy perfectly, Kethfer said. He told me that humans have long memories and longer reach. Those who harm innocent people will eventually face the consequences of their actions, even if it takes generations to achieve justice. The Galactic Council chamber had grown completely silent as Ambassador Kethfer prepared to deliver his final testimony. The alien representatives had listened with growing horror to his accounts of human warfare, but they sensed that his most important revelation was yet to come. Everything I have told you about humanity's military capabilities is true, Kethfer began. But it does not explain the real source of their power. I spent 3 years observing human soldiers, studying their tactics, and trying to understand what made them so effective in combat. The answer I discovered changed everything I believed about the nature of warfare. The Zephyrian ambassador moved closer to the center of the chamber, scarred features reflecting the weight of hard-won knowledge. The humans are not naturally violent. They are not a warrior species driven by bloodlust or conquest. What makes them terrifying is that their greatest acts of destruction come from their greatest acts of love. The concept was difficult for many council members to grasp. Most galactic species separated military efficiency from emotional attachment. Professional soldiers were expected to remain objective and calculated in their decision-making. My final assignment was to observe the liberation of the Kepler colonies, which had been occupied by hegemony forces for 2 years. Kethfer continued. I was embedded with Major Danny Ford's battalion during the assault. Ford was a former elementary school teacher who had enlisted after his school was bombed during the initial invasion. Major Ford represented everything that confused Kethfer about human warriors. He carried photographs of his former students in his combat gear. He spoke gently to wounded enemies while treating their injuries. He planned devastating military operations while discussing children's artwork with obvious affection. Ford's battalion was tasked with retaking the city of New Cambridge, where 3,000 human civilians were being held as forced laborers, Kethfer explained. The hegemony had turned the city into a heavily fortified prison camp, using the civilians as human shields against potential rescue attempts. The tactical situation was nearly impossible. Any direct assault would result in massive civilian casualties. The hegemony commanders had calculated that human forces would be paralyzed by their unwillingness to endanger innocent lives. Ford studied the problem for weeks, developing a plan that seemed impossibly complex, Kethfer continued. His soldiers would infiltrate the city in small groups, identify every civilian location, and coordinate a simultaneous strike that would eliminate the guards while protecting the prisoners. The operation required perfect timing and extraordinary precision. Each soldier needed to know the exact location of every civilian in their assigned sector. Any mistake could result in friendly fire casualties among the people they were trying to save. What disturbed me most was watching Ford prepare his troops for the mission, Kethfer said. He showed them photographs of the imprisoned civilians. He told them about the families, the children, the elderly people who were counting on them for rescue. By the time he finished briefing them, every soldier in his battalion was emotionally invested in the mission's success. The personal connection between the soldiers and their objectives violated every principle of professional military conduct that Kethfer understood. Emotional attachment was supposed to cloud judgment and lead to tactical errors. The assault began at dawn with coordinated strikes against 12 different targets simultaneously, Kethfer reported. Ford's soldiers moved through the city with supernatural precision, eliminating guards while avoiding any action that might endanger civilians. I watched Sergeant Amy Foster disable an entire guard post without firing a shot, using only hand-to-hand combat techniques. Foster's approach epitomized the human philosophy of surgical violence. She had studied the guard schedules for weeks, identified the optimal moment for her assault, and executed her plan with mechanical efficiency. But her motivation was entirely emotional. Foster explained her tactics while we moved through the city. Kethfer continued. She pointed to a building where children were being held, and told me that her own daughter was the same age as some of the prisoners. She was not fighting for abstract military objectives. She was fighting to protect children who reminded her of her own family. The liberation of New Cambridge succeeded with minimal casualties among the rescued civilians. Ford's battalion eliminated over 500 hegemony guards while losing only 18 soldiers. But the most significant moment came after the fighting ended. As the civilians were being evacuated, I watched Ford comfort a group of traumatized children, Kethfer said. He spoke to them in the same gentle voice he had once used with his students. He showed them drawings that his former pupils had made and promised them that they would be safe. The contrast between his tenderness with the children and his ruthlessness toward their captors was absolute. The duality of human nature became clear to Kethfer during those final days. Humans were capable of extraordinary violence, but only in service of extraordinary compassion. Their capacity for destruction was directly proportional to their capacity for love. Major Ford explained the source of human military effectiveness during our final conversation. Kethfer continued. He told me that humans fight hardest when they are protecting something precious. The more they love what they are defending, the more terrible they become to their enemies. This principle explained every aspect of human warfare that Kethfer had observed: their willingness to sacrifice themselves, their refusal to surrender, their patient pursuit of justice, all stemmed from their inability to abandon those they considered family. But Ford revealed something even more significant, Kethfer said. Human protective instincts extend far beyond their own species. They will fight just as hard to defend their alien allies as they will to defend their own children. The ambassador's voice carried a note of wonder as he continued. During the Kepler liberation, Ford's soldiers risked their lives to rescue Zephyrian colonists who had been captured alongside the humans. They treated alien civilians with the same care and dedication they showed to their own people. This revelation had profound implications for galactic politics. Humanity did not seek to conquer other species. They sought to protect them. Their military expansion was driven by the desire to defend their growing family of allied civilizations. I realized that the Council's attempts to contain humanity would trigger the same protective instincts that had destroyed the hegemony. Kethfer warned. If we treat humans as enemies, they will respond with the full force of their defensive capabilities. But if we treat them as family, they will die to protect us. The choice facing the Galactic Council was stark and simple. They could continue viewing humanity as a threat to be managed, or they could embrace them as the guardians the galaxy desperately needed. Captain Amy Foster's final transmission during the Kepler operation summarized human nature perfectly, Kethfer concluded. As she died defending a group of alien refugees, she sent a message to her daughter back on Earth. She said, "Tell Emma that Mommy kept her promise. Tell her that we don't start fights, but we sure as hell finish them. And tell her that the galaxy is full of people who are now part of our family." The silence in the council chamber was absolute as the implications of Kethfer's testimony settled over the assembled representatives. Humanity represented something unprecedented in galactic history. A species whose capacity for destruction was matched only by their capacity for love. "I stand before you today with a single recommendation," Kethfer said. "Grant humanity full membership in the Galactic Council, not as subjects to be controlled, but as the protectors we all need. The humans have taught me that some species are not meant to be conquered or contained. They are meant to be welcomed into the family." The ambassador's final words carried the weight of absolute conviction. The humans will fight to the death to protect anyone they consider family. The question we must answer today is simple. Do we want to be their enemies, or do we want to be their children? As Kethfer stepped back from the speaking platform, the council members began to understand that they were not just deciding humanity's fate. They were deciding whether the galaxy would have the most dedicated guardians in its history, or the most implacable enemies it had ever faced.